For us Italman people, salmon fishing is the foundation of survival and traditional economy. Our most important holidays are the day of the first fish, when salmon first enters Kamchatka's rivers. This is the time for weddings, for visiting one another, for celebrating and enjoying life. You cannot separate culture from traditional life, and you cannot separate either from the life of indigenous peoples. They are one.
It's not our fault that someone came to our lands, took them and pushed us out. No, sometimes through violence, destruction, repression and economic pressure. It was important to prove that this is our land, that we have the right to hunt here, that we have the right to our culture. And we proved that. It is not our fault that they came to our land, not ours.
These folkloric festivals are beautiful. They warm the heart, but they are also a way for the state to co-opt and pacify indigenous communities. Instead of letting people live traditionally and keeping corporations away, the authorities say, no, don't fish, don't produce anything, just dance, celebrate weddings, and we will take care of the economy.
Hello everyone, you're listening to the Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial podcast about the rights of indigenous peoples. The right to traditional ways of life, to self-determination, to culture and to language. This is our third episode and it is dedicated to culture. We'll talk later about what exactly we mean by culture, but first let me introduce our guests who are here in the studio with me and Stefania Kuleva. Dmitry Bereshkov, a representative of the Italman people, editor of Russia of Indigenous Peoples.
Good evening.
Andrey Danilov, a Sami activist, a member of the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia.
Hello.
Ghassan Gusseinov, a philologist and cultural researcher.
Good evening.
And Stefania Kuleva, Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial.
Hello, everybody.
Culture. A few words today are misunderstood and emptied of meaning as much as this one. Often culture is reduced to theaters and poetry collections, and I am not even touching the old Soviet expression cultured person. Today we are not talking about theaters. Our topic is something closer to a way of life. Stefania, perhaps you can briefly tell us what we are going to talk about today.
Yeah, I think you are right. The concept of culture goes far beyond that old Soviet idea of what one is supposed to do in a house of culture, amateur performances, theater, singing. Culture exists in a vast diversity of forms. A way of life is only one expression of a much deeper cultural universe, a worldview shaped by the taiga, the tundra, by the landscapes and stories of the North, Siberia, and the Far East.
Maybe Andrei can tell us a bit about how this is connected to hunting. And perhaps please first say a few words about yourself.
My name is Andrey Danilov. Until 2022, I lived in Russia, in the Murmansk region. When the war began, I was forced to leave. I moved to Norway, to another part of our historical homeland, the land we call Saami. There, I received political asylum. Hunting is part of our culture, it is part of our language, part of everything. It is connected to our clothing, our terminology, and to nature itself, which protects us and feeds us. So even when we live in cities, sooner or later we return to our origins. We return to traditional hunting, though something we were once deprived of when our lands were taken and industrial companies arrived. In May 2018, I received a hunting permit. According to Russian law, I applied to the Ministry of Natural Resources to have a special mark added to my permit, a mark allowing me to hunt without a license in order to preserve traditional hunting and our way of life. This right is guaranteed by the Constitution. It is guaranteed by federal laws. Until 2021, there was a major court case, and in July 2021, the Constitutional Court ruled that I must be allowed to hunt and must receive that mark. And not only me, this right applies to all indigenous peoples of the North, Siberia, and the Far East.
As I remember, your case was very important. The key question was whether a person who no longer lives in a chum, who does not follow a stereotypically traditional lifestyle in every detail, still has the same rights as those who do. And it was extremely important that you demonstrated not only the right to hunt, but that this right applies to those who live modern lives, who use modern technology, and who live in today's world. Can you say a few words about that?
It's not our fault that someone came to our lands, took them, and pushed us out. Sometimes through violence, destruction, repression, and economic pressure. We had to leave for the cities just to survive, and yet we always were, is, and will stay. It was important to prove that this is our land, that we have the right to hunt here, that we have the right to our culture, and we proved that. It is not our fault that they came to our land. Not ours.
Dmitry, I have a question for you. Andrey just said that hunting is part of culture. I'd like you to tell us a bit about yourself and your people's culture, and please expand this take. In what way is hunting a part of culture?
Traditional culture of indigenous peoples played, I believe, a decisive role in my own life. I was born in the village of Milkovo, central Kamchatka, a typical Russian village. Even though my grandfather, born in 1895, was a hunter and fisherman, he worked in a collective farm. My grandparents were a typical rural family. Milkovo was founded in the 16th century by Cossacks, and although it is located in the very center of Kamchatka, in the middle of the land we called Ukwali, it became the most assimilated part of Kamchatka. In that region, the local indigenous population had long been considered Russian. At the same time as Italman culture and traditional life survived most strongly in the northwest of Kamchatka, near the border with the Koryak district, where the living conditions were harsher. There, the only village where the Italman people are now the majority, Kovran, managed to survive. In central Kamchatka, the population became assimilated. My grandmother only knew a few words in the Italman language, but my uncle, Georgi Porotov, did not want to follow the path of his parents. He went to study at a cultural arts college, then moved to the north of Kamchatka, to the Koryak district, where he began working with Italman and Koryak culture. Back in the 1960s, he began writing poetry. Today, he is considered a patriarch of Italman national culture and literature. Everyone on Kamchatka knows him. Under his influence, my brother started studying traditional choreography. Later, he became a dancer in the national ensemble Menga. My mother also began writing poetry. In the early 1990s, as I was finishing school and deciding what to do next, I got my passport and I registered my nationality as Russian. At that time, my parents asked me to register as Italman because there was a struggle for fishing quotas and it mattered for participation in fishing. But I consciously chose to register as Russian because I thought it would be more advantageous. I understood that life would be harder if I identified as indigenous. At that moment, I did not associate myself with national culture or with fishing, but around the same time, the Kamchadals of central Kamchatka began reconnecting with the Italmen of the north. They began organizing joint events and festivals, visiting each other. I still did not feel that I belonged to that culture. But after university, I was invited to the north of Kamchatka to Kovran village for a traditional celebration of nature and gratitude, Alkalalalai. And after that, I simply fell in love with the national dances, songs, culture. I began to understand who indigenous peoples really are. Immediately after that festival, I quit my job and began working in the indigenous movement. About the question you raised, the connection between traditional life and culture, this is the key issue. In the previous podcast episode about education, it was said that if people do not have a real need to learn their indigenous language, no perfect school system can save that language as a living language of communication. And it was noted that the most natural environment for this need is traditional economic activity, everyday work, traditional subsistence, life on the land. We can draw a parallel with culture here as well. Of course, people of different ethnic groups have an inner need to preserve their culture as part of who they are, as part of belonging to a community. But for indigenous peoples, culture is also inseparable from daily life, from everyday living, from traditional subsistence. Many rituals, songs, and dances are integrated into and in harmony with traditional ways of life. Reindeer herders have their own traditions, and for us, for the fishermen of Kamchatka, for the Italman people, no, we have ours. For us Italman people, salmon fishing is the foundation of survival and traditional economy. Our most important holidays are the day of the first fish, when salmon first enters Kamchatka's rivers in early summer, and Alkalalalai, a major festival of gratitude to nature, held when the salmon run ends in autumn. This is the time for weddings, for visiting one another, for celebrating and enjoying life. You cannot separate culture from traditional life, and you cannot separate either from the life of indigenous peoples. They are one.
I would also like to return to the question of terminology, as these concepts are difficult both to translate and to define. And I want to ask you, Ghassan, for a clearer definition of these terms.
We cannot say that today the only correct term to describe this phenomena is traditional culture or traditional way of life, because it is obvious that the traditional life of the indigenous peoples of the North has changed. These peoples have become a tiny drop in the sea of aggressive industrialization in this huge region. It is impossible to say that the economic life of indigenous communities will continue in the same form in the coming decades. That will not happen. But what we need to do in searching for correct terminology is to define what has happened to indigenous peoples in the former Soviet Union and today's Russian Federation over the last 70 to 80 years. How do we periodize it? What was before? In what state of life have people ended up in today? A key work that describes what is happening to indigenous peoples today is a book by Thomas Stearns Eliot, published in 1948, begun at the end of the Second World War. It is called Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. And although this book describes cultural processes more broadly, it also applies to what happened with indigenous cultures in the former Soviet Union. What is the meaning of this book? What is the meaning of the concept of culture Eliot writes about? He shows that Soviet cultural policy was deeply contradictory. On one hand, there was official support for small peoples, development of languages, creation of alphabets, schools, and education. On the other hand, throughout most of Soviet history, there was an assimilation policy, dissolving small indigenous groups into the large Soviet nation, built around the Russian language. Russian-Soviet space became the environment into which these peoples were expected to dissolve, and they did. And strangely enough, this assimilation happened partly through this very idea of culture, treated as folklore, as something tied only to traditional subsistence. Like, here is fishing, here are the dances of fishermen. Let them do that. Let them keep their yurts and chums and traditional houses. Let them describe how they fish and how they celebrate their holidays. Let them stay there. And let them not create a language to describe the new world and other lands. On bulldozers with oil and gas rigs. That is one side of the issue. There is also another one. The name of the committee where Andrey Danilov works struck me as very important. The International Committee of Indigenous Peoples. This is extremely meaningful. About 30 years ago, when I first went to Helsinki, I was there at the Sami cultural festival. I saw a map of the peoples of the north, of the northern hemisphere. And if you look at that map through the eyes of the Sami, the world looks completely different. This includes Chukotka and Kamchatka as well. If we look at the map of these peoples from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, we see a world of very close interaction among cultures. Not a world of tiny cultures surrounded by a large Soviet or a Russian culture or any other dominant culture, but a big world, ancient and deeply interconnected. The task now is to expand this interconnectedness, this international cooperation, to see these cultures not as small and fragile, but as vast, stretching across the northern hemisphere, at least across its northern regions. But here lies a danger as well, because a state, especially a repressive state like the Russian Federation today, will immediately see this as undermining unity, as playing into the hands of those who want to break up Russia, and so on. But we understand perfectly that the only salvation for each small culture, for each indigenous people, is international cooperation. Here we face a paradox. On one hand, each person sees themselves as part of their own people, a bearer of a small minority culture. On the other hand, that same person becomes a single unit of a much larger international whole.
Andrei, this directly concerns you since the Sami people live across several countries. How does this cooperation work in practice?
And may I add to this question? The Sami are a truly divided people, something often mentioned by states that worry about separatism, often much more than the situation actually deserves. At the same time, some indigenous peoples consciously choose not to build a nation state. We must recognize that culture and statehood do not necessarily go together. The Sami show this very clearly. Yet it is also a tragedy that the lands where these people lived for centuries were divided by state borders. And we know that Sami cooperation across borders between those living in Scandinavia and those in the Russian Federation led to accusations of being foreign agents simply for working with their own people across borders. I would like Andrei to say a few words about that.
I will tell one story. On August 30th, 2021, I was detained by the Russian police. It happened at a festival, strangely enough, a Viking festival in the city of Monchegorsk. I was not wearing Sami clothing, but I was carrying the Sami flag. The word Saami was written on my backpack. In the end, I was detained. I received 5 days of administrative arrest. A lot happened during that time, but one moment stayed with me. A man in civilian clothes spoke to me politely for 2 hours, and everything he said came down to one question. Don't you want to create a state? If you have Saami, then you must have a government. If you have a government, then you must have your own territory. If you have your own territory, how do you see this within Russia? And will you separate? I explained to him, we are a people who have lived on this land for thousands of years. We live here and we will continue to live here. No matter what governments existed or will exist, we remain on our land. We will have our rights. We will protect our land. We will protect our language and our culture. How we do that, that is our choice. Let me step aside from the story for a moment and tell you about one campaign. It's called Careful Protect Sami Culture, also known as Careful Fake. When we see fakes or misuse, we respond publicly under that hashtag. It is a large campaign, active since 2017. It is based on international law and on legal norms we created as one people across 4 countries. We have the Sami Council, a body that unites Sami across 4 states and represents us internationally. And in 1999, I received a document stating that our culture and our Sami traditional costume is our passport. Therefore, we do not allow our cultural clothing to be used without permission from the proper Sami authorities. The Sami costume is our passport. By a person's costume, we can see where they are from, which family they belong to, whose son or daughter they are when they were born. We can see everything from the costume, so you cannot just put it on. There are rules. A person cannot simply use it. If someone wants to, they must come to us, and we will create a special costume for them. Then it will be correct. For example, a cafe called Youth released a gingerbread cookie called Loparka with narrowed eyes and stereotypical northern ornaments. When we launched our campaign, the cafe removed this product and said, "Sorry, we will rethink this." There are many such cases. We award certificates of shame when someone misuses our culture. And this continues not only in Russia, but also in Norway, Finland, and Sweden. And we continue to fight this. We have reports, legal standards, and regulations from the Sami Parliament, from the Sami Council, and from UNESCO. We write about how Sami culture may be used and what the rules are for our culture and for other indigenous cultures as well. When I visited Kamchatka again in August 2021, I went to stay with the Italman people, and something amazed me. I felt completely at home. Everything was the same forest, the same mountains, the same water, the same culture. We understood each other instantly, even without words. So we are not separate peoples. We are one, indigenous peoples who live from nature and protect nature.
Both Andrei and Ghassan touched on the same problem, what is now called tokenism. Folklorization of culture, reducing people to some kind of archaic image. As Ghassan said, let them live in their tent, let them stay in a mythic past. Then individual elements are extracted, a costume here, a song there, a couple of dances, and turned into staged performances that do not serve the real culture of that people at all, but instead serve completely different, often opposite ideologized purposes. Dmitry, could you say something about this exoticization of cultures?
We call it the festivalization of indigenous topics in Russia. This was a problem in the Soviet Union and in the years after, and in recent years it has become extremely severe. Authorities and even some indigenous leaders who work for the authorities ignore the real problems of indigenous communities, ignore what is happening to land, to ecology, to resources. Instead, they present a decorative postcard image at festival, a mannequin of indigenous peoples that they pull out when needed and then put it back into a dusty closet. On Kamchatka, this is also a painful issue. We constantly have festivals. Kamchatka constantly sends delegations to Moscow and abroad to present indigenous culture. On one hand, this is a huge problem because it overshadows real indigenous rights issues. On the other hand, one of the main ideas I want to express in this conversation is about economics. They are connected. Life, traditional way of life, culture, economies are all linked. Why do we struggle to preserve languages? Because authorities do not fund them, because it is not profitable, you cannot sell it. But they fund culture because you can show it to tourists, display it on stage in the Kremlin, and indigenous people participate in this. And if I criticize the authorities and those leaders who organize these postcard festivals, I do not blame the people who sing and dance. I understand them. For them, this is a way to do what they love and at the same time earn a living. This connection between finances, economy, culture, and the survival of an indigenous people as a people, for me, it is one of the most important issues in my work. It is also directly tied to indigenous rights. Andrei has already spoken about cultural expropriation, about the Sami costume, and similar examples. There is something deeper behind this. I can give an example from Kamchatka. It is the land of salmon. Everything in our life is connected to the salmon economy. There has been a long struggle, now decades, between commercial fishing companies and indigenous communities as our fishing grounds and quotas are taken away. The Kovran River in terms of salmon was not very significant. For a long time, commercial companies did not pay attention to it, but in the late 1990s, beer consumption in Russia grew and beer needed snacks. Kovran is a river with a huge amount of smelt, and Italman people began earning a living from smelt fishing. We use traditional weirs, a method that existed long before Russians came. A structure placed across the river allowed people to catch large amounts of smelt with little effort. But authorities and the fishing inspectorate banned this method, saying it wasn't on the official list of approved fishing gear. Italman communities fought in court for a long time to have this traditional tool recognized. Eventually, it was added to the official list, but as soon as that happened, a commercial company took advantage of it. They claimed the fishing rights to that river and took the fishing ground away from the Italman community and began using the traditional weir themselves as a commercial tool. The Italman people continued working there, but not as owners, only as laborers earning pennies, while the business owners profited. This is one example of cultural expropriation directly tied to economics. I remember in Soviet times when my mother applied for Northern allowance payments, she was told, "Why would you need extra payments? You are locals." In the Soviet Union, Central Kamchatka, Kamchadals did not have the right to fish, while the Italmen of the Northwest in the Koryak district did as indigenous peoples. When Kamchadals asked for fishing rights, they were told, "What fishing? You're Russian." In the Soviet period, this was less visible because everyone had work, but in the late 1980s, when true hunger began, I remember living almost without bread. People had to survive on their own. This problem affected the entire North. When the Soviet supply system collapsed, people began trying to survive with whatever they had locally. A river full of salmon ran right through our village, but we could not fish. It was forbidden by law, so people began organizing communities and associations to fight for their rights. This happened across the entire north of the Soviet Union. In Kamchatka, this also triggered cultural revival. People began remembering traditional names, restoring family histories, organizing cultural festivals, dancing. So, cultural revival came both from new freedoms and from necessity. The same thing is true today. With state-funded culture, people dance, travel to festivals, get funding, but it's state funding. So for me, culture is something directly tied to a people's ability to live. And to preserve and develop international cultural connections are important, as Ghassan said, but the foundation is connection to territory, to the land, to the source of income. If people tie their future to the land, if it is their livelihood, then cultural tradition will live. No matter how authorities treat them, they will survive. But for this, one must fight for rights, for land, defend it. Unfortunately, in today's Russia, everything is crushed under the heavy boot of repression. But I believe that in the future, these issues will rise again. They already exist, only in the shadows, under pressure.
I notice that each of us keeps returning to the Soviet Union. It seems that the root of this evil lies there. Ghassan, while preparing for this podcast, I found a book you helped create. It is titled The Burn of the Native Hearth. I would like you to tell us a bit about that work.
This is a book we began compiling in 1988, together with Denis Dragunsky. It was based on the idea that the Soviet Union must change, but the question was, how should it change? The foundation we proposed was this: a minority is not an ethnic group, not a linguistic or religious group, but one person. One person is the smallest minority, and that one person may feel internally that they speak on behalf of a group. They may consider themselves a representative of an entire people in one single body. At the time, this sounded abstract, but today we see that it is not abstract at all. Our respected speakers, Dmitry and Andrey, now in exile, they are exactly such individuals. They have tied their lives and destinies to their people. Another issue, and this comes from the Soviet era, a very global problem, is that our speakers were not originally representatives of their people. They became them. Dmitry described very clearly how he once chose to register as Russian. He chose his identity for practical reasons, and later he became Italman.
Let me clarify. When I registered as Russian, I would ask to notice my great-grandfather was a real hunter and fisherman, and his ancestors were Italmen. My great-grandmother traveled alone in winter to deliver furs from our village to Petropavlovsk. So it is not that we did not consider ourselves Italmen, I simply made a practical decision at the time.
One of the authors of our collection proposed a striking idea. Ethnic identity is being without becoming. To be a member of a people is to be something without having become it. Most forms of nationalism are built on this idea. But here we have a totally different situation. This was a personal, cultural, civilizational choice, an individual choice. Tragedy of the Soviet system was that people did not have that choice. And unfortunately, the Soviet experience has still not been understood. Just as in the mid-1950s, no one managed to process the Stalin's Soviet Union period. So after perestroika, no one had time to process the Soviet experience either. A remarkable scholar of northern indigenous cultures, Igor Krupnik, spent decades from the mid-1970s to the late 1980s collecting stories for a book called Let Our Elders Speak, Stories of the Asian Eskimos Yupik. It describes real practices indigenous peoples faced, not the romantic idea of preserving traditional life. Individually, a person may be a hunter and justify their practice by belonging to a tradition. But in today's globalized and collapsing post-colonial world, indigenous peoples are pushed out by large corporations and powerful state structures. Instead of allowing people, as in the case of the Italman, to live traditionally in their territories and keep corporations out, they say, no, 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 you will not fish. You will not produce anything. Just dance, perform your dances, celebrate weddings, and we will take care of the economy. So the main strategy of the state in dealing with indigenous peoples is exactly this: to deprive them of any economic rights that should belong to them, and leave only the weekend folklore, let them gather, wear their costumes, dance, but not do what they have always done, not engage in any real economic activity.
This whole conversation is extremely interesting to me. And what Andrei and Dimitri said is relevant not only for the peoples of the Russian North, as Ghassan rightly noted. This is a global issue. I remember words once said to me by a representative of an indigenous nation in Siberia. He told me, "We have a gift, but we cannot share it with humanity." He wanted to go beyond the circle of his immediate neighbors to share his culture with the wider world. And here is a dilemma for me connected to debates about cultural appropriation. I really liked the example Dimitri gave, where appropriation, the literal takeover of a traditional fishing method, destroyed the livelihood of indigenous people. This is a clear and painful case, but there are other more complicated situations. Many of them are known from international experience. We recently discussed the legacy of the writer Grey Owl, a person who lived as a Canadian Indigenous man and whose books helped many readers discover and fall in love with the world of Indigenous Canada. Later, it turned out he was born in England. He was accused of cultural appropriation. And here lies a problem. For many people, his books opened the door into that world and created love for it. At the same time, he misrepresented who he was. The same festivals Dimitri mentioned, it inspired him personally to reconnect with his heritage. And yet they also exoticize and distort tradition. So how do we find an approach, not only in the post-Soviet world, but in the broader post-colonial context? How do we navigate this?
About your question and about what Ghassan said regarding these decorative festivals and how the system should be balanced, I want to return to the experience of the Italman people in the late 1980s and the Kamchadals in the early 1990s. In the Soviet Union, culture was also folkloric and decorative. There were red chums, stage festivals, and dance troupes. But as soon as little freedom appeared, the first signs of democracy, the ability to speak and influence authorities, people immediately began talking about participating in decision making, about the right to use traditional lands and resources. Through cultural festivals and celebration of traditions, they began saying our culture is inseparable from our land and our territory. When indigenous peoples have the right to influence decisions about their territory, a balanced system emerges. Today, authorities and corporations have crushed these possibilities. Land rights have been taken away. Only the decorative culture remains. I think this is negative, of course, but I also remember the Soviet times when even this folkloric culture helped indigenous people survive pressure from communist rule. It was poets and cultural figures who became the first leaders of indigenous associations. So even if this decorative culture is compromised, it can still carry seeds of revival. When the political situation changes, these cultural groups will be able to move forward again, remembering the experience of the late Soviet era and return to the conversation about land, territory, and resources.
And this concludes our third episode of the Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial Podcast, dedicated to indigenous peoples of Russia and their rights. In our next episode, we will talk about the right to language. For now, we say goodbye to our guests and thank you all for listening. This was the Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial Podcast.